All right, thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch, and we're going to try to have a little bit of fun today. I like to have fun, so I want everybody to enjoy themselves. So we're going to have a panel discussion from some experts here in our community. First up will be Dr. Raul Font, President of the Latino Community Development Agency. We recognize Dr. Font here. Representing the City of Oklahoma City, Aubrey McDermid, Planning Director for the City of Oklahoma City. Thank you, Aubrey. And then finally, Mark Snead, from President of RegionTrack, our official economist in the group. Thanks. Come on up. So, we're going to spend a few minutes answering some questions, and I've been told not to go out of order, which we talked about, and I won't do that. But I may ad-lib a little bit. So here we go. Okay. So, Aubrey. So we talked a little bit about population growth. We've talked a little bit about where our current population is, where have we come from? What does the last 10 years look like, and where do you see us going?
Okay, well, as you all know, we do a census every 10 years. So if we're taking 2018 and looking back at 2008, we had to do some gazentas. So I've got my notes here. Right now in Oklahoma City, city limits, not the metropolitan statistical area, which is the 1.4, did you say? Your numbers are 1.4. Oklahoma City's area now, we're about 660,000 people. 10 years ago, we were about 100,000 people less. 562,000 is about where we estimated that was. So just for comparison, 100,000 people is kind of the equivalent of a Norman, Oklahoma, or a Boulder, Colorado. So that is pretty significant growth in 10 years' time. And looking into where the growth has gone in the last 10 years, we've done a lot of outward suburban growth, especially on the west side of Oklahoma City, the Canadian County portion of Oklahoma City. Downtown has seen a significant increase in population. And what's interesting to me is that our highest growth rate was in 2015. It was almost 2%, which is a pretty remarkable, like you said, almost a doubling of what the national growth rate is. And in the years between 2013 and 16, we also had a peak in our growth rate, which has slowed back down. But on average, we are above the national average. We're around 1.6 over the last 10 years growth rate, which is a pretty healthy and robust amount of growth, which can be both a blessing and a curse.
But growth is a high-class problem. We've just got to have the right solutions for that. So that's a good way to think about it in terms of population growth. We've added a Norman or added a Boulder. So Mark, you did a long-range forecast for the chamber years ago, and what materialized? How far off was that from what you forecasted?
Well, we'll know in 2040. So, what we were hoping to do was build a growth model. Population is closely tied to economic growth and to employment. Extrapolating current trends forward, what we tried to do is construct a model that looked at key factors like capital spending and labor force participation rates, level of education, other factors that show up nicely in the data in economic growth, project what Oklahoma City is like, and then tie that to population. I cut out. And so we have some projections. These would be baseline numbers. Model like this is that you can change the underlying assumptions and then trace through and try to get a better feel for what the outcome would be under alternative assumptions. So I'll give you some baseline. So in 2040, between now or we did this in 2015, now in 2040, we would grow from about 1.4 to 2 million people. Our magic date is 2040. We'll get. Others would have more optimistic or less optimistic numbers, but we're saying it's around 2040. you'll have about 1 million wage and salary jobs. Do some numbers here. We have about 650 right now, so you're talking about a roughly 50% increase in the number of wage and salary jobs between now and 240. Income is where I think it gets pretty interesting. If we're at about 50,000 per person today, it'll grow to about 110 by 2040. And those numbers always seem exaggerated or a little hard to digest, but if you think back 25 years, we were talking about high 20s, 28, 9 income, and then growing to the 50s. So it's essentially slightly more than a doubling of income. If you do it in real terms, you're talking about a third of an increase in real per capita income from about 52,000 to about 70. So substantial growth in real income. We don't think the labor force participation rate is going to play a big factor, maybe go up slightly. Education, our best estimate is that we probably move from about 13.2 years of education per person, something like 1.2 years beyond high school, to 13.6, about a 0.4, almost a half year of additional education per person. So in short, some pretty substantial changes in a 25.
So, kind of recapping all that, more education, more higher salaries and wages, and more people.
Yes.
That's really good. That sounds pretty good. Okay, so Raul, so we've heard a lot about the diversity of the U.S. population and how it's changing. How would you compare and contrast Oklahoma City to the entire country?
Okay, so I'm going to take the largest or the fastest growing ethnic group in the nation and compare to the fastest growing ethnic group in Oklahoma City, and it's the same group, Latinos. We have to be careful when we look at statistics because some statistics include Puerto Ricans. And for those that do not know, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, so sometimes they don't know where to put them in the stats. And sometimes they don't know where they fit either. But all these numbers that I'm going to give you are going to depend on what's going to happen in the next couple of years. Maria has made an exit of Latino Puerto Ricans leaving Puerto Rico. Right now, the numbers are 300,000 have left, professional Puerto Ricans have left the island, because still today, and I don't want to get all excited yet, still today there's blackouts in Puerto Rico, water is an issue, the housing is an issue, so they're leaving Puerto Rico, they don't want to go to Miami, they don't want to go to the East Coast, so they're coming this way. Okay. Oklahoma has had a major influx of Puerto Rican in the last couple of months. There's also a caveat. I had breakfast with the council from Mexico, Peru, Spain, and you know that there's a actual embassy here for the Guatemalans. They're experiencing problems with the Venezuelan and Colombian issues, political issues there. They're migrating into their countries, so their professionals are leaving their countries. And with them coming to Oklahoma, guess where they're going to land? So the numbers I'm going to give you do not include any of this, okay? So the largest growing population in the nation are Latinos. The figures vary from 54 to 59 million, about 18%. Oklahoma is 17%, so almost the same. There's been a change in the dominant group of Latinos. Even though Mexicans are still the number one, there's an increase of Latin and Central American Latinos, and we have them present here. The presence of Peruvians and Guatemaltecos in Oklahoma is growing fast. We're going to talk later on about where they are at and the misconceptions about this group. And it's going to impact eventually what we see today. It's the youngest population in the nation at an average of 28 years, while the mainstream population is at 39, the youngest. So you could see that there's a young population, and they are in the major cities. The difference here in Oklahoma, We have them in the urban. They're actually leaving the urban population area, and they're going into the areas like El Reno, Mustang, Putnam City. We're getting calls from Kingfisher, Hydro. So they're leaving this city area because they're being profiled in the city. And so they want to get away from it. And so they're no longer in the south side. For those that have been around Oklahoma for a while, Northwest Classen used to be African American Asian. 84% of that school is Latino now. So they're leaving the south side as well. And so what's happening is the other school systems, including Moore, don't know how to handle them. That's the word that they use. I thought that we taught kids, period. So that's a good comparison, just to answer the question as succinct as I could.
Well, let's go out of order here.
Hey, he started it.
But I want to follow up on that. So you left that with talking about the kids, and it's about the kids, and we're to educate the kids, and with this growing Latino population, and many of them are in our school systems. What do you see the district doing to adjust to this, react to this, and what would you like to see done?
Okay, for those who don't know, I'm an educator by trade, and so that is a very dear to my heart topic, and my comments today do not reflect the new superintendent. I already spoke to him. But we have failed the Latinos and African American students in our city. And if you look at the data, all the F schools are in predominantly Hispanic and African American communities. If in this city you don't send your kids to a specialty school, they're sitting in an F school. Regardless if we agree with the State Department of Education way of determining what an F school looks like. So you cannot tell me that we're doing a good job with our kids, because we are shaving the bright and the ones that can move their kids to a specialty school. And how fair is that to have a neighborhood that has an F school because they cannot move out into a specialty school? So what is the district doing? They're not. Because the charter school answer is not working. On top of that, the charter schools are not being treated fairly. So even the ones that are doing a good job with our kids are not being seen as equals in the school system. So how are we failing them? Well, if you remember, Mr. New, Superintendent New, in 2015 came out in May and said that we suspend more Latinos and African Americans than any other school district per capita in the nation. So not only are we not educating them, we're not being sensitive to their needs as well. So let's send them home. I'm a street kid. You send me home every time I do something, I'm going to act up in school. The answer is not in home. Their parents are trying to work to, as they think, this is America, I'll work and you educate them. Well, these kids are suspended at home. So the Latino agency decided, we'll take those kids and we will educate them. And in a year, we had 300 of those suspended kids in our building. 85% of those kids went back to their buildings and never had a referral again. Guess what the first program that they canceled? That program. So I don't know what to say. It's all that is statistics. So we're not doing a good job. What should I do if I were the superintendent? We have to learn how to work with kids in crisis. Number two, we need to work with parents and the community. Number three, we need to make sure that we know about second language learning and ESL. Number four, we need to make sure that we know how to deliver our instructions to kids that don't learn the mainstream way. This is just common sense. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this, and apparently we do a poor job in the state, in the Oklahoma City area, because when we give them to a charter school, they do an excellent job with them. And I'm hot already. Yes, ma'am. That's all I'm going to say. I'm already in trouble.
Well, I appreciate you getting in trouble because I'm in trouble too because I went off script.
Okay.
And so we'll share together. No, thank you for your comments because I think that's important. And but I think what I took from your comments though is there's a tremendous opportunity there.
Oh, there is.
And we're fortunate to live in a community that is growing. And, a lot of these decisions we're going to be making have long-term implications. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And I wanted to get back on script here, Aubrey, coming to you. So how are we using these projections and population to guide our planning going forward at the city?
Well, the planning department uses demographic analyses and population projections in different ways, kind of high level, and then we go down to a granular level depending on what programs or what initiatives we have going on. But probably the biggest way that we use it is when we create our comprehensive plan, which we just redid from scratch, a comprehensive plan in 2015. And so we have to project out, usually those are long-range plans going out 20, 25, 30 years. So we have to get a crystal ball and polish it and try to figure out where population growth is going to fit inside the city, where jobs are going to go inside the city. So since that's pretty recent, I'm going to tell you about what assumptions we made with our comprehensive plan, and that's that by 2050, Oklahoma City, just within the city limits, will grow by 300,000 people and 180,000 jobs. So we use that to start to model growth scenarios for the city. We modeled if we grew the same way, what would that look like, which would result in a further decline in the central part of Oklahoma City, population loss, abandoned buildings, neighborhoods declining. It would increase the amount of growth that would have to go out into suburban areas that probably don't have 100% of city services in terms of water, sewer, police, and fire protection. So then we modeled what happened if we grew more efficiently. We did 3 different case studies for growth scenarios. And so the comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2015 was one of the more progressive growth scenarios, and that guides decision making and it guides investment in trying to rebuild and reinvest in the urban core to follow market demands and efficiencies for the provision of services. So every decision that's made by Planning Commission or City Council filters that through the lens of the comprehensive plan and the data that backs it with the population estimates and the growth estimates. And then we also help other agencies. We actually have been working with the Oklahoma City Public School District on their analyses of their school, the facility structure itself, the feed that's going to go into that school, what's happening with the neighborhoods around it. When the city is investing in neighborhoods that are declining and the population in that school is starting to lower to the point that the school district is thinking about closing that school, if there are interventions that we can have as a community, investments we can make as a city into that neighborhood to stabilize it and help grow it back, then that school doesn't need to go away. So we're trying to work in partnership with the Oklahoma City Public School System to supplement the research and the data that they have. So that's one example of a partnership that we have. And we assist anybody, in small areas looking at changes that might impact things like the viability of their commercial districts and small neighborhood plans. So that is, it's like the nuts and bolts of planning.
Just planning 101,
yes.
Right? Well, thank you for sharing that with us and simplifying it, because I know there's a lot more that goes on embedded in that. So Mark, you're very familiar with long-term forecasts, and you were talking about 2040, and it's understood that the demographic changes in a community have an influence or impact on future prosperity or future generations. Can you talk a little bit about Oklahoma City and what you see?
Well, I think the first question you have to ask is your city already strategic and responsive to demographic trends? And I doubt there is even a minor demographic trend that either the city or the chamber or some other group isn't already working on actively. So in Oklahoma City, this is almost a matter of being a cheerleader in that respect. That the city, just think about some of these things. I would almost argue that the single most pressing and interesting and revolutionary demographic-related change is people, high-skilled workers in particular, picking up and moving to areas where they have high lifestyle amenities. I mean, that is the single greatest underlying current, I think, in America today. And think about the things that we've done in Oklahoma City. I mean, I threw we in, we all have, everyone has. Starting with the MAPS projects, the most recent one I read about today is the Innovation District, a group savvy enough to bring an NBA team to town, the recreational and leisure amenities just on the south side of Oklahoma City. You can even throw in maps for kids. We haven't solved all the problems with these, but what I would suggest is you do live in one of those cities that we categorize as being strategic and innovative already. So I think in that sense, I'll just simply say the people we have in place in Oklahoma City are doing a remarkable job.
Sorry.
Thank you. So Aubrey, how does the Plain OKC, with this rising increase in population, these opportunities we have, how do we address that in terms of, or how's the city planning for that in terms of housing?
Now, boy, I geek out on this subject. It's fascinating to me. Again, when we did the comprehensive plan, since it was just a couple of years ago, we were able to hire consultants to do a housing demand study for Oklahoma City to see what our situation was and where we would house the people that would move in, understanding that we have a lot of housing stock in Oklahoma City. We also have a lot of vacant abandoned structures. And I think that's a result of how Oklahoma City has a large land area. We have very cheap dirt, so to speak, easily developable. We have plentiful infrastructure, so our growth has spread and expanded outward. So if a neighborhood doesn't have the newest homes or the best schools, people move their families further and further out, which causes further and further decline in the original and older areas of Oklahoma City. But that still provides housing stock that is not being taken advantage of to the best extent possible. And we look around the country, and other cities with populations that we will be approaching in the next 20 or 30 or 40 years are characterizing their cities as having a housing crisis. And I hope that Oklahoma City can learn from those lessons and avoid having a housing crisis, but we certainly have an affordable housing issue. And the demographics play into that. When we did our study, the major factors that influenced where people lived and their neighborhoods was, number one, good public schools. Number two, the proximity to schools, shops, jobs, and entertainment, because again, the growth patterns in Oklahoma City have tended to concentrate different things. Only neighborhoods in one area, only shopping in one area, only institutions in the other area. Walkability has been a big factor. Again, Oklahoma City hasn't done the best job historically about continuing to build sidewalk infrastructure throughout our large, expansive land area, and a variety of housing types to meet all different needs. So when you think about where Oklahoma City is right now, our traditional neighborhoods with the two-parent children households, that's declining, and single-parent households and non-family households are increasing. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But this surprised me. By 2030, the largest population growth will be among those older and younger adults, and Gen Y and Gen X will constitute more than 70% of home buyers. And they have a different expectation for housing. Right now, our housing inventory lacks that diversity of housing types. By 2030, if we continue in this same way, our housing inventory will only meet half of the projected housing demand to accommodate those people, which means they will not live here. They will move somewhere else to find that housing. And I also found it interesting, too, that when we did a study of our existing housing market, our single-family detached housing is the most predominant housing type. It constitutes about 70% of the housing stock in Oklahoma City, but only 40% of that housing stock and that housing type is needed to support the demand. So we're oversaturated in that area, but we have a gap and unmet demand in another area in the housing market, which is the smaller lot single-family apartments, condominiums, and townhomes. So these are the housing types that the population that we're expecting is going to need, and in an affordable way. So I feel like if we don't address decline, rehabilitation of older structures, the construction of denser housing that's more affordable, then we will be in that state of a housing crisis like some of our peer cities.
Location besides location and proximity to education and jobs and entertainment, we've seen a lot of condominiums, apartments develop kind of in inner city here. Does it also apply kind of outside of the kind of greater city limits?
Well, I'm not as familiar with outside of the city limits as I am within, but I do know that there's pressure to build apartments on the edge of Oklahoma City, which Mayor Cornett's been very vocal about, because the people who would tend to live in those apartments might not work in Oklahoma City, and that's kind of a thing, is we're trying to create neighborhoods where people can, get to know their neighbors, have community, work in that place. So we see multifamily housing in different parts of Oklahoma City, but I certainly have been happy to see more multifamily in our core.
Okay, thank you. And you touched on kind of the baby boomers and their role in home ownership. And so, Mark, we're seeing that all across the country as these baby boomers retire. We're seeing it in our company. What do you how do you replace that intellectual horsepower and that career that they had? How does that influence how do you see that going forward for Oklahoma City?
Yeah, the baby boomer question is a really complicated one, and Aubrey highlighted some of the subtle shifts in the population and the makeup. If you look at us relative to the nation, we have this baby boom hump in the middle of the population as well. I'm at the leading edge of the baby boomer, and it stretches into the current 60s, those who are in their late 60s, still in the labor force though. But there's some key differences, and I actually think it will make the baby boomer transition easier in Oklahoma than in other states. This is what we look like. Below the age of 25, we have way more population than the U.S. We're younger by about a year and a half than the U.S. population. As you go, though, from about 25 to 45, we look different in the sense that we have more than the U.S. in the core age working group. We look much more similar to the U.S. as you go into those in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. We look very national-like in the 70s to 85, and then we're very low relative to the nation once you go above 85. And that's sort of reflected in the mortality statistics as well. But our baby boom hump looks different. It's not as large, and it ended much more quickly than the U.S. hump. So what you're going to see is those who are currently 58 is the peak of the baby boom spike. So whenever they start reaching 65, which is essentially seven or so years, and moving into the years in which they retire en masse, that will be the absolute peak. And I think the thing we forget about is that it's going to quickly unwind. So there are two, it's a dual problem. It's how many do you have coming into the labor force after those who are 58 and above represent the peak, and offset that diminishing number of folks who push out. And what you have in Oklahoma is a smaller baby boom hump up front and a younger and larger numbers of population coming into the labor force right now at the ages of 16, 17, and 18. So despite the fact that we do have that issue, it is still a rather sizable hump, and right now people are leaving the labor force at fairly large numbers. It will be, I think, meaningfully softer here than in many other areas. So I hope that describes it as that dual problem of coming into the labor force to offset those leaving. We sort of have the advantage on both ends.
And do you see more people coming into the labor force than leaving the labor force in terms of retirement, or is it roughly the same?
We have really unique labor force participation rates. If you are under the age of 18, your labor force participation numbers have been declining for decades. If you're in the core work group, ages roughly 25 to 45, maybe stretch it to 50, the labor force participation rate hasn't really changed in the past several decades. It essentially is as flat as a pancake. And what's happened over the age of 55 or so, the labor force participation rate is rising. So what you really are seeing is more young workers falling out of the labor force, despite the fact that older workers are entering, and we're still seeing some slight downward pressure on the participation rate. But nonetheless, the core working population has not shifted in any meaningful way.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Okay, Aubrey and Raul, what misperceptions, if there are any, that do you see about Oklahoma City?
Want me to start with me? Okay, so if you project into about 10 to 15, 20 years from now, we're going to see a constant with African American growth, a very small increase of Native American and Asian students, and a large jump of Latinos, according to the projections, okay? Right now, Oklahoma City Public Schools is 54% Latino. So the misconception here is that mainstream teaching is going to reach these kids that apparently don't learn in that same fashion. So there has to be a paradigm shift. Because if there isn't, these same kids will grow up and be incarcerated. They would be in your homes while you're somewhere else. They will most likely be having commodities or leaving. One misconception. Second, 94% of the Latinos 18 and under are American citizens. Their parents may not be here with papers, but they sure are. But I hope they don't treat them like they treat Puerto Ricans. How to get that in there. Third misconception, not all of us are illegal. And so you'll be surprised, I get stopped. A Latino with a nice car, when I'm in the summer, in shorts with all my jewelry on, I get stopped. So that profiling has to stop. There's this misconception that we're going to leave the state. They don't want to go back to their countries. The ones that are not from here. The ones that were born here, they're staying here. Misconception, the increase of Latinos in higher ed, bursting at seams. A lot of Latinos, OU, UCO, OSU, OCCC, Rose State, and they're coming back to their communities, and in the middle of a $15,000, $20,000 housing area, you'll see a $100,000 house. That's one of the kids that came back to their community. That's a misconception. And the way you come back, you have to start changing your ways. And I'm going to talk later on about a word that I learned doing the preparation for this about gentrification. Because that's what we're doing in our cities. We're mainstreaming the areas that we want economic development, which I'm all for, at the price of moving away and uprooting a population that have nowhere to go. But that's a conversation for later.
Might be a good segue into some things I've heard in going through a new comprehensive planning process. It's interesting to me that that Oklahoma City was born out of the land run, and that we still continue to have a little bit of the land run mentality, and that our property is our property to do whatever we want to do with, and nobody should intervene or interfere in that. We have a very strong sense of our property rights, as we should, but when it comes to change, it's scary. A lot of people in Oklahoma City that can't comprehend this, we're adding a Norman or 2 Normans in the next couple of decades, think we really don't need to do anything different because we've been able to survive this growth period of Oklahoma City's relatively short life the same. And I just think that is a misperception. We do have to change. And as we change, things like you mentioned become a factor in that, because we have a limited amount of land area and a limited area that we serve with services that we can afford to continue to serve with services. So we kept coming up, against people who, even when we put the numbers in front of them about how much land area was left to develop and what the cost would be to us, not just costs to our pocketbook or to the city's financial bottom line, but cost to society, cost to public health, cost to mental health and education. The development patterns and the way we grow absolutely affects those dynamics inside our city. It affects how people interact with each other, how we support and help each other. So wrapping your head around that we really do need to change, we might need to think about doing things differently, has been one of those conversations I think that we've had, some successful and some not. And then the other issue is downtown. You know, we really have been focusing for many years through the MAPS programs to rebuild our downtown core. A lot of the citizens that we interacted with when we were going through the process of the most recent bond issue and passage of the 2017 bond issue, is people were upset because Oklahoma City has invested so much in our downtown, and they didn't understand why. There was so much need left around the city for infrastructure and quality of life amenities, but the investment in our downtown was so necessary because cities are economic engines. Downtown is the economic engine of a city. And downtown is not the scary place that everybody leaves at 5 o'clock and nobody lives anymore. Downtown's actually a very vibrant place. It's not just a place for millennials. We're seeing a lot of families moving downtown now, and a lot of older people moving downtown. But with those dramatic shifts in where people are living and how to accommodate families and populations around Oklahoma City, unfortunate things like gentrification can happen. So we have to be very, very careful about growing in a way that is smart and measured, and sometimes it's hard to do when it happens very quickly.
Can I piggyback somewhere here? Okay, so I think that the community would be all right if you would be upfront with them. So I sit down with some architects who are designing a little park in front of our Latino agency, which is on 10th Street and Walker. And so they were asking me after the fact, what do you think about this design? And among the design areas in that park was a walking park for dogs. And so I said, I don't think there's a South Side person that owns a leash. So don't tell the community that's for them. Tell them it's for the rise of some apartments that they're going to have there, and they're okay with that. But don't design something thinking it's going to, and actually they did not smile at all. But it's true. So if you're going to build in areas where they're going to have to uproot, then be frank with them, and this is going to be for uprise, it's going to benefit everybody, and I think things will be fine. There was the trend in the 50s and 60s, if you look at Capitol Hill High School, Southeast, they were powerhouses. And these people that were there, the Mashburns and the Spiegels, they decided when there was that busing coming into the South Side to leave the South Side. And so they created more. So there was this white flight, I call it, into leaving the area that was going to be maybe mixed, diverse. But the dichotomy now is that then we are pushing them out, because we already went north, and we made sure with the hospitals we took care of the African American community, and now we don't even have enough kids to enroll our kids in school out there. So now it's going south. So now, why can't we all live together? Why can't we try to diversify the town and take the best out of everybody? And that's what we're not doing. And it's going to come and haunt us because you as an individual who believes in the city, you have been disrespected in the way that you are. 20 years from now, they're going to remember. They're all citizens and they are from Oklahoma. So either they're going to leave Oklahoma or they're going to have a bad taste about Oklahoma. And you don't want citizens that have a bad taste for the city.
So you both in your comments talked about gentrification. Why don't we kind of piggyback on that and, you want to?
So for gentrification, it's basically mainstreaming areas that you populate. It could be your home, it could be your neighborhood, and so you make it mainstream. You know, have you heard the word assimilation? Or versus acculturation? You are going to impose your ways, whatever those ways are, into an area. So when I moved here in '81, I went to Moore, and among the things that I heard there was that we keep our housing at a certain height so that we don't have certain people move in. That's a form of gentrification. So if we decide that certain areas need to look like a certain way, then we're going to move away another population. So I'm hoping that the city doesn't do that so they could move away poverty and they could move away ethnicity. Because if that's what we're doing, shame on us. That's gentrification.
Aubrey, do you have anything?
Well, it is an issue, and our comprehensive plan really strives to guide diversification within the city, and not just accommodating a diverse, ethnically diverse community, but the diversification of housing types and mix of land uses. So wherever we can see an area where somebody wants to integrate a different type of housing into a neighborhood or do revitalization in a neighborhood, it's best to do that in a scattering way rather than a concentrated way, because the concentrated way, if property values are low and it's a great physical location for community, it tends to create its own problem. That investment ends up making homes unaffordable for people who might live there. But if those investments are kind of woven throughout the fabric of our community, they tend to just naturally start to bring new families, new folks into an area, and that concentrated gentrification effort can be mitigated. So we encourage it, but I don't really know what the magic bullet is, because the city is not responsible for market choices and what developers choose to invest in.
Well, I think therein lies part of the challenge. I mean, whatever business any of you are in, the days of the silver bullet are gone, right? I mean, these are real world problems that you're addressing, you're trying to deal with, that have impacts for generations to come. And so they're really talking about long-term solutions here. And so, Mark, you mentioned earlier your forecast is 2040 we'll reach 2 million population. What does that mean? How's it viewed? What are the impacts of that? Do we care?
Well, I'm sure it'll be exactly on target too. And by the way,
I wrote it down right here. You said it, so.
I don't think anyone in Yukon owns a leash either. I think that's a more widespread problem.
There are going to be more Latinos out there.
My neighborhood, yes. Yeah, we have that issue too. 2 million is an interesting number, but I will go so far as to say that any increase in population has something of a magical element to it. And there's a broad and a growing line of research that's focusing on this question. As a city grows, as the city scales up, what is expected to happen from an underlying economic and demographic perspective? And there are a lot of things that we think we know pretty well now after looking at the data over many years. And so if you have cities that are equal in all other respects, yet they are larger, what happens? Well, in general, they tend to have higher wealth levels. They tend to have higher average incomes. They tend to have deeper labor markets. They tend to have more specialized labor markets. They have more specialty firms. They have more high-tech labor forces. There are quite a number of these. Better employment opportunities. The financial sector is deeper. And it even translates to government. When the city size increases, there are efficiencies to scale of government in terms of providing utilities, whether it's power in your world or whether it's water, wastewater in the city sense. All of these things tend to improve. You tend to see rising property values, and as the city gets larger and larger, these efficiencies and these growth effects tend to intensify. But it's not a perfect world. There's a trade-off with every one of these benefits, I think. And some of these, I think, are pretty obvious. You get greater density. I'm not a density guy. I will live in the suburbs and move to the edge of the suburbs, wherever that edge goes, because I don't like density, but most people do. So greater density. You get a higher serious crime rate, you get higher air pollution, higher water pollution, higher light pollution. You get more relative water consumption per person, more relative power consumption per person. You have longer commute times. There is no perfect design. If you're focusing on economic factors, you have a trade-off in all of the other sort of socioeconomic factors. And I think there's a recent line of research that sums this up. If you try to take these things down to the micro level, down to the person or the worker level, what's really happening? And the conclusion is that what you're seeing is the average age at which a typical person in the labor force reaches their peak productivity. You know, as you complete your schooling and as you move into the labor force and as you gain more specialized skills, at what point do you reach your peak productivity? Well, it's probably right around 30 years of age. But if you look at large versus small cities, the age tends to fall below 30, and in larger cities and in smaller cities, it tends to concentrate above 30. I don't know that I've hit my peak productivity yet, so I'm not sure where all these super productive 28-year-olds are coming from. But nevertheless, I think trying to take it down to that micro level and explaining it in terms of human behavior, that is one of the dimensions that the deeper labor markets, the greater employment opportunities, the general pace of life speeds up as city size increases. It tends to explain on an individual level why cities just tend to produce better economic performance as they get larger. So there you go. 2040, write it down.
Write it down. 2 million people. Well, I'm still digesting that I'm past my peak and it's all downhill. So let's turn this around and be a little more positive then. So maybe we can start with Raul. Your projections, your forecast for what does Oklahoma City look like? What do you see for 2030, 2050?
Okay, so I don't want anybody to leave thinking that I am anti-Oklahoma City. I've been all over the country. This is home. It's nice to bring family and relatives to downtown now that there is a downtown and we have a skyline and all this other stuff. So that is nice, but I would not want to be in the shoes of the city people that have to make decisions because they're tough decisions. But I think if they bring everyone to the table that they need to, and they're part of the conversation, I think we'll be all fine. We've weathered other things and we will weather this as well. I know I'm going to bring a very ugly word here, but Tulsa. So tomorrow I'm going to be going to Tulsa, and there's something called the Mayor's New Tulsa Initiative. And let me read this to you. It says, it seeks to offer pathways for socially responsible immigrant integration and to foster connections between immigrants and long-term Tulsans. They're now a step ahead of us. They have decided Tulsa is becoming very diverse as well. And they have realized that they can't ignore it anymore. And so this new mayor is taking the step of having a conversation about what can we do to welcome individuals that are not from Tulsa. Forget about they're not Latinos or they're just Tulsans. What can we do to welcome them? How do they fit in? What can we do? And I think that's something that we need to do. For our Mexican consulate to have to go to Little Rock because we didn't offer them space here, that's bad. That's bad business. Forget about them being Latinos. It's the trade, the business, economic development. And so they have 1/3 of the Mexican people that we have here, but he has to go to Little Rock and have his offices there and then come in a bus and take care of their population here in the city. Those things need to change, and I think they're easy to change. And I think that we have a mayor that's very outgoing and that he's listening. And so I'm not telling you anything that I haven't told him. I don't get invited to a lot of places, you know. So I think that we'll be fine, but we just have to get the right people at the table.
Thank you. Audrey?
I agree. I think we're going to be a lot more racially and ethnically diverse in 2030 and 2050. I think that's going to bring about a lot of these changes and different ways of thinking. In terms of some things that we can obviously see, I mean, Oklahoma City has been making significant investments in itself through MAPS. We've built this park that's going to start coming online, downtown streetcar. So I think investment around the park and along the streetcar line within the next 10, 20 years will be significant change that we probably can't even imagine what this area looks like. I think it's probably going to tend to be more mid-rise in terms of height, but that's going to help in terms of density. It's going to help in terms of a mix of different land uses and affordable housing options. So I think that that might take a little pressure off of some of the other issues that we've discussed today. I think that that's also going to spin off a lot more private investment, and I think in the next several decades. We're going to see a lot more corporate headquarters and economic development activities happening because of the things we've done to lay the foundation for that. But when you look that far out, there are so many things right now that are foggy in the crystal ball. And the biggest thing that I think drives where people choose to live and choose to invest and choose to work is the quality of education. That's always been the elephant in the room. Any discussion that we've ever had has come back around to education. If you don't have an educated population or a place where families want to put their kids in school and raise their kids, you don't have a workforce, you don't have investment. So that, and then transit and transportation. The world in the next 20 to 30 years is going to shift in the way that people are using transportation and transit with all of these different types of self-driving vehicles. We have no idea what's going to happen with that, how that's going to impact things like, do we even need parking structures anymore? How are we going to be using our highways that are supposed to be congested in the next 20 years? But the investment in transit is so important, especially when you have density in a city and you have populations that can't afford to have a car to drive around a city as large as ours to their employment. And it's really also hard to build transit in a city that's spread out. If you don't have density, that is just not an efficient way to run a transit system. So a lot of these factors that we've been talking about, where people choose to live, where our investments are going, social, ethnic changes, have to all fall into place in a thoughtful way so that we can start to make those significant improvements that are going to affect the quality of life. So I'm hoping I'm going to be around to see all of that, but it's a scary and exciting time, I would say.
Thank you, Aubrey. Mark?
Well, I jotted down a few things that I think are pretty likely to happen. I think there will be much more urban and suburban versus rural. I think we'll continue to draw from the outskirts of Oklahoma. Oklahoma City is definitely a magnet, both in-state and from out of state. So I think we're going to have an infusion of a lot of new folks going forward, and to some degree at the expense of the rural areas. I don't think that will stop. I agree with Aubrey. I mean, I think this is an easy one, that downtown will continue to develop in an important way, and I think it will outpace the suburbs on just about every economic measure. The momentum in downtown Oklahoma City is just impressive. It is remarkable. I have to add this, though. I think the path the city actually takes, sort of my 2040, and it was April, by the way, that it'll happen, I'm sure.
Get that down, too.
No, I think that forecast, it remains to a large degree influenced by the health and role of the oil and gas sector over the next 20 years. If it collapses and crushes, it will act as a drag. If it receives tremendous stimulus, it will probably push the numbers upward. Our base case assumes that it remains a steady influence. Definitely more racially diverse, and I think part of that is the inflow of residents from outside the state, mostly in the metro areas, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, but we're already seeing these pockets Raul has talked about all over the state. They are largely Hispanic pockets, but they are large and growing very rapidly, and they're transforming these cities and have presented growth potential, I think, in areas where it hasn't been there in my lifetime. No one's mentioned this, but I think we will become way more politically diverse. I think the state will still be red, but it will be bordering on purple. And over the next 20 years, it will definitely change. Land values, we've talked about it a little bit. Aubrey's mentioned it, that we have cheap dirt. And I think we still have a lot of cheap dirt, but I would argue that by 2040, we will also begin to see the upward pressure on land values that Texas really just started seeing 5 years ago. I think we're probably 25 years behind them in that sense, but you'll see upward pressure on land values. And I would argue probably the most important economic change is that incomes in Oklahoma City will probably go from slightly below the U.S. average to slightly above. I think that will be a long-run trend that takes hold, and I'll stop at that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. We have time for one question. One question. Okay.
Nobody wants it.
Right over here. Okay. We'll bring a mic to you. That's all you got, yeah.
Thank you, guys. Jesse Riesenberg, Catholic Charities. So my question is a little bit about the shifting demographics and the poverty situation and those affected by poverty and low income. I know you talked a lot about this massive growth and what that might be for those of us who would make more money and all those different things, but what are the shifting demographics in poverty?
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at that. That's a concerning factor in most cities, and the concerning part about it is that poverty is kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. It doesn't get better without intervention, and the root of a lot of people that are in poverty, like we go back to this, it's the education, there's the justice system. A lot of those things, when you get into a place where you are in poverty, your family's in poverty, is really difficult to get a leg up. And so Oklahoma City is starting to see some really great organizations like yours that are reaching out. I think a lot of our nonprofits are doing very targeted work to help people and families overcome the situation that puts them in a state of poverty. There is no way that we can sustain ourselves as a community or as a society without helping people in need. And so I think that our city, whatever we can do, we have a lot of programs. We manage the community development block grant programs. We focus on areas of low to moderate income and helping people with their housing needs. We help the homeless population. We partner with organizations throughout the city. We have to have more of an emphasis at the federal level for the distribution of those dollars to communities so they can make a difference. And so I think a lot of the things that are our challenges really need to rise up to the level of the legislature and the federal government to assist with just the fundamental things, the societal needs. And I don't know where and how we can focus those efforts in terms of the shifting demographic. And I do know that our idea is to not let any areas of concentration develop in Oklahoma City. So we are constantly following where we learn that there are areas of need or higher crime rates or school dropouts and try to focus programs and services to those areas.
As a school administrator, in the last 15 years, what we were seeing is the single family income ended up being dual family incomes. And now they didn't qualify for certain types of programs for their kids in school. So what we're seeing within the Latino community is that mom and dad both are working now. Used to be only one. And so that's going to take them out of poverty, kind of, but then they're going to lack some of the resources and I guess comfort that they had with other types of programs. So I think that it's going to increase, but I don't know what that's going to do to the family, because in the Latino family everybody works, so their kids are working as well. And so all of that is income.
Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Raul and Aubrey and Mark for joining us today. Good job. It's I think we heard there's reason for optimism. There's a lot of opportunities we have in our community. At the same time, we have challenges, and the key there is to continue to create opportunities for those and enrich the lives of those living in our community. So again, thank you all for doing this. Again, thank you, Carla, for hosting luncheon. Those of you that enjoyed this, and the next one will be October 17th around manufacturing innovation right here. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you. Good job, Mark.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.